All right, so my name is John Kim, and Drew asked me to speak a little bit about what business and marketplace leaders need from the local church. And I kind of jumped at this opportunity because I'm often asked to speak to a room full of business leaders. I'm not often asked to speak to a room of pastors and church planners. But I've always had a great affinity for people who plant churches. It's a very taxing mission. It's very gratifying, but it can also be very taxing. And I myself consider myself to be a relatively sort of pastoral person, pastoral investor and entrepreneur. I'm oftentimes pastoring other business leaders. And in many ways, there's always been a bit of an awkward dynamic between business people and church leaders. And I think a part of that is because in the business world, you're oftentimes measured by how good your outcomes and specifically how much money you make. And church leaders are naturally telling business people, hey, look, that's actually not that important. The love of money is the root of all evil. So you have this weird dynamic where the world is telling you one thing, the church is telling you another thing. But at the same time, resources are necessary to plant churches, for building campaigns. And so we're approached, for these types of endeavors, and there's this tension, and that tension can oftentimes be awkward. But I really wanted the opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about how marketplace leaders and pastors can really relate to one another better, because I think we both need one another, and actually a lot more similar than we might appear on the surface. And so just a quick background on me. I know this slide is hard to see, but I'll talk you through it. So basically, I'm the son of Korean immigrants. I'm born in New York City, and I was raised in the suburb, and I didn't grow up in a Christian home. But that doesn't mean I wasn't religious. I was very much steeped in the sort of the church of the American dream, which is all about working hard and making it and winning and being very American, I suppose. And I left for Boston for my schooling. I did my undergraduate at Harvard and my PhD at MIT. And I came back to New York City about 20 years ago now, and I spent the first 10 years of my career managing the personal wealth of a guy named Michael Dell, who's, I'm sure many people know, is a founder of Dell Corporation. And over the last 10 years, I've been essentially managing our family wealth through an entity called the Karaman Group, which essentially serves our family interests. My faith tradition, I came to faith through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship as a college student. It was a very sort of sweet little Bible study. It was a Mark study, I think, that first introduced me to life with Jesus. But where I really came alive in my faith is through the Vineyard, which is a movement of churches that was founded by a man named John Wimber. You'll see a lot of Vineyard overtones in what I'm about to talk about later on. And most recently, my wife and I founded this thing called Coram Deo, which is a house of worship, prayer, and entrepreneurship. And it's a take on the Benedict option. I don't know how people here are familiar with that term, but the idea is it's sort of an urban monasticism type movement that my wife and I are sort of pioneering with a handful of other families here in New York City. Next slide. A couple qualifiers for what I'm about to say. The domain that I operate in is mostly financial services, corporate executives, and entrepreneurs in places like New York City, San Francisco, and Boston. So that's sort of my world. Those are the people that I talk to, that I'm listening to, that I'm around all the time. My perspective, so I'm Gen X, and then I sit in between the baby boomers ahead of us and the millennials to the left of me. And those are two very distinct worlds, very distinct experiences of how they relate to the local church, and so I kind of have a window into both of them. And my objective today is to be prescriptive as opposed to descriptive. And what I mean by that is I'm going to be talking about what I think marketplace leaders need from the local church, and that may not actually be what they think they need. But as Steve Jobs once said, one of the worst things you can do when you're designing consumer products is ask consumers what they want, because they have no idea what they want. And so that's sort of the lens through which I'm coming from in this talk. So let's first define what is a marketplace leader. And so basically, first two things, at a high level, their job is to sort of assess the environment, to figure out what the market conditions are, and then they set a course for the team's direction. So they're evaluating and then sort of casting vision. They are responsible for both people and profits. So they're responsible for their employees, and they're responsible for these outcomes. And I think the central thing that distinguishes a marketplace leader from just what I would call, for lack of a better term, rank and file employees, is that the essential thing that they do is they bear the benefits and the costs of risk-taking. So their job is to, in some sense, look at the lay of the land, chart a course, predict the future in a way, and if things go well, they're rewarded. And if things don't go well, they're either fired or something bad happens. And so when you look at this is a lot like what church planners do. Church planners are tasked to sort of assess the market environment, to see what the what the cultural norms are in the various locales that they choose to plant. They're really responsible. Obviously, they're shepherding people, and although it's not profits, it's more fruit, souls, things of that nature. And risk-taking, I think, is highly embedded in most of the church planners that I know. Their disposition is at the core entrepreneurial. And so I say all this because I want to just highlight that there's just a lot of similarities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I experienced sort of the local church after I came to faith in my early 20s, and kind of where I am today in that journey. So if we could go to the next slide. So how marketplace leaders experience the local church. So I'll talk a little bit, so I came to faith in my early 20s. I actually remember the first retreat that I ever went on. There was a fellow speaking, and I think he said, with the best of intentions, his statement was, if you're a marketplace leader, if you're a business person, your job is to do what you do very well, to make money, and then support missions, church planters, things of that nature. And through the first maybe 10 years of my faith journey, that was largely the kind of message that at least I heard and that a lot of my colleagues heard when they were sort of in church circles. And so essentially, in the workplace, the idea is do what you do well, be ethical, don't screw up, don't show up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times with some sort of moral failure, and then evangelize, tell people about Jesus in the workplace. But then outside the workplace, the message is you should be tithing and you should be radically generous to support missions and related work, volunteer time and skills to help build the church, and in some sense, there was always this implicit message that the real meaning and joy in life is found in things like relationships and family and things of that nature. And so, first 10 years of my career, I more or less followed this script. I was very determined to be good at what I do, to make sure that I had super high ethical standards for myself. I was rather bold in how I evangelized, maybe foolishly bold, but that's how you are in your 20s, I suppose. You don't know what you don't know, and so you're just I was very direct about what I thought it meant to follow Jesus. And my wife and I married a great lady who doesn't care much for things, and so we were able to be radically generous. We lived on a small fraction of our income. As I mentioned earlier, I love the local church. I love pastors, and so I spend a lot of time helping build a church, and I spent a lot of time with my family and friends, and so all of this was great. So I did a lot of the things that I was supposed to do, but there was sort of a tension, I think. And so the trouble that I had was there was this very substantial gap between sort of my lived vocational experience and how the scriptures talk about life with Jesus. And so I think a part of why that is that, the way we talk about being a Christian businessman, and this is actually particularly true, I think, for the boomer generation, is that it inadvertently sort of reinforces the sacred-secular divide. There's this implicit message that the marketplace work was just an input into the real kingdom work that is being done in the church, on the missions field, in these nonprofits. And I remember about 10 or 12 years ago, there was a book that came out, From Success to Significance. And it was sort of all the rage in the Christian domain. And the basic idea was that, hey, you've chased success for the first 25, 30 years of your vocational career. Now it's time to chase significance. And so the implicit idea somehow is that whatever we were doing in the workplace for the first 30 years of your life, it wasn't significant. And so that tension is something that I think was very difficult, and frankly, it just wasn't very satisfying to me. And so basically in my early 30s, if we can go to the next slide, please, I realized I had this essentially I had this really fragmented theology. And what I really wanted was this concept of coram Deo. And coram Deo is a Latin phrase. It means in the presence of God. And theologian R.C. Sproul, he writes, to live coram Deo is to live one's entire life in the presence of God, under the authority of God, to the glory of God. So to live coram Deo is to live one's entire life in the presence of God, under the authority of God, to the glory of God. And so the basic reality is the majority of a marketplace leader's waking hours is actually spent on their vocation. If you think about it, 16 times 7, all right? 16 hours you're awake, 7 hours per, 7 hours in a week, 7 days per week. So it's just north of 100 hours. And most marketplace leaders are going to spend more than 50 hours a week in the office doing marketplace things. And so what does it mean for all of that work to be done coram Deo, under the authority of God, to the glory of God? And so, next slide, please. So I went on a bit of a journey. And basically, I went to the scriptures, as one is prone to doing. And I realized the scriptures have so much to say about how to excel in areas that marketplace leaders really need. Things like strategy, creativity, risk-taking, people management. There's just tons of guidance in the scriptures about these kinds of things. And we have tons of examples, starting obviously with Joseph as an advisor to Pharaoh, Bezalel in Exodus 31 as he was designing the temple and the tabernacle, and obviously Daniel serving under Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And what I learned is that the Bible often states the Spirit of the Lord fell upon so-and-so. And as a result, they were able to do the following things. And I think it all comes together when Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2 about the mind of Christ. And he talks about how wisdom from the God of the universe is revealed by the Spirit. And I remember reading this, and I was saying to myself, this is sort of an earth-shattering and mind-blowing promise. In many ways, it's sort of like the ultimate competitive advantage. I mean, if we really have access to Jesus, if we really have the God of the universe and sort of the divine plans for people to prosper and for the world to look more like it does in heaven is actually given to the sons and daughters of God, that we can actually have access to that and then begin to apply those things in all the areas that are relevant to marketplace leaders, things like strategy, creativity, risk-taking, and people management. And so what did that mean for me as sort of an investor entrepreneur? I essentially framed my entire investment philosophy around the parable of the minas, or the parable of the talents, that is told in Luke and the book of Matthew. And I really began to hunger and thirst for divine revelation as it relates to all my business decisions. And, I actually started to believe with actually my whole heart that the God of the universe really is sovereign, and he cares deeply about the substance of what I do. He's not just interested in sort of, in who I am, and then if I'm successful here, that this money can be contributed to missions and church planting and things of that nature. And I actually remember I was actually, ironically, on a missions trip with an entrepreneur who developed software. And we're on our way to the African bush. And I asked him, so what do you do? And he says, I develop software. And I go, oh, what kind of software? And he described the kind of software he does. It's a little bit technical, so I won't bore you with the details. But then I asked him, well, how are you able to develop this stuff? And he's like, well, the first thing we do is we gather every morning and we pray. And we ask the Lord for divine revelation. And I sat there and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy. Like if I ever sat down with a Fortune 500 CEO and asked him, what is your competitive advantage? We sit down and we pray. I mean, I'd look at him as if he had horns growing out of his head. And that's exactly how I felt. But I discovered there's actually a whole world of people who actually are operating this way. And in some sense, they existed at the margins of the church. But they are, in many ways, fellow co-conspirators in that, they want to live coram Deo. They do want their lives to be all about Jesus. They recognize that their business is their primary, the mechanism through which they're practicing their faith. And so they're like, we're gonna go all in. We're gonna believe that everything that the Scriptures promises, that the lives that are modeled by people like the Daniels, the Bezalels, and the Josephs of the world are fully available and possible for us today. And so basically that's kind of what I'm looking for. It's sort of one of the missions of my life is to basically cultivate communities of business people who are living life, coram Deo, living life in this way. So if we can go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about tomorrow's marketplace leaders, many of whom are going to be millennials. Now, millennials basically, in about 8 or 9 years, they're going to comprise about 75% of the workforce, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And the shortcomings of this generation from a vocational perspective are actually pretty well documented. Boomers and Gen Xers tend to write a lot about how millennials are very self-centered, they're very undisciplined, and they're not particularly committed to the various things they do. And church planners, I know, they talk about this all the time. It's infuriating. You invest all this time and energy in a millennial leader, and then before you know it, they're just gone. They don't even tell you about it. But that's just generally how they roll. That's how they flow. But they do have a lot of qualities that I think can form the basis of a much healthier dynamic with churches than what boomers experienced and even what my generation experienced. And so I think the claim that I want to make is that the kind of church that this conference gathers, the kind of values that are inherent that you see on the front page of the New City Gathering, I actually think that they can leverage millennial marketplace leaders and their default wiring and their attributes to point them to life with Jesus. And so here's my generalization of millennials. They want to work in companies with a strong sense of purpose and a values-driven culture. This is very different from the boomers and even to some extent Gen Xers, where they basically were like, you know what, I'm going to spend my whole career at IBM, and I'm just going to, what IBM does is sort of not that important to me, but as long as I kind of do my job and I'm a good earner, that's sort of the important thing. But millennials are different. They want what the business is about. They want the purpose, and they want sort of the values of the organization are very, very important to them. And so the other thing about them, the more and more I talk to 20 and 30-something marketplace people, is that, they really want the faith they espouse and the work that they do to be highly integrated. They're not as good at compartmentalizing their faith. And I think this is a high virtue of millennials that you often hear about, is that it's very important for them to be authentic. So for them to be authentic, if they're going to be about following Jesus, or if they're going to be about certain values and principles, those have to be embedded in the things that they actually do. And so I actually think this is a very good thing. I think this is a very good thing for how church planners and pastors can basically pastor millennials, especially millennial leaders. And I'm going to go through a couple quick examples in the next couple slides. So really, to answer the question, what business and marketplace leaders need from the local church, this is sort of, this is my take on, what church planters can do to basically get the most out of, or support and empower marketplace leaders. And so I want to talk a little about current workplace context and challenges for marketplace leaders. So in most industries, it's very difficult to be vocal about your faith. Tech and media in particular, they're just downright hostile to God. Sort of well-documented case, the CEO of Mozilla Foundation, the Firefox browser, was essentially fired because he supported traditional marriage. And he essentially lost, it wasn't so much a legal thing, but he basically lost the confidence of the entire organization because in Silicon Valley, obviously, there's a revisionist view of what marriage is and just human sexuality in general, which is obviously a huge topic that we can't touch today. But somebody who had a traditional view was basically deemed to be unworthy to lead an organization. And so friends of mine in the technology space and the media space, that is the number one question that I always get asked is, how can I actually be a committed Christian? How can I stand up for the faith in a context like that? And the second thing I'll say is sort of arguments, rhetorical flair. I don't think they get you very far. I don't think that if someone were to sit down and actually break down exegetically why it is that we believe what we do about marriage, they would it just wouldn't compute for the people that, for the typical employees in this environment. And so the challenge is really for our lives and the way we do business and the way we interact with people, that just has to be the testimony to the risen Jesus. People don't want to debate these types of things. And so the question for the church is, how do we form people who can thrive as witnesses to the resurrection in these types of environments? That's the question. And so here's one potential response. I think the church, for marketplace leaders, should be a place that offers spiritual formation. So the picture that I'm trying to paint is, marketplace leaders molded into the image of Jesus through spiritual disciplines and the Word of God. And so if we encourage a culture where individuals organize their days around a rule of life, sort of specifically for the purpose of intimacy with Jesus, I've been doing this now for the last, maybe 5 or 6 years. I think Pete Scazzaro, who's one of I think he's either speaking later or he spoke at some point, he wrote this book called The Daily Office, and I've handed it out to hundreds of entrepreneurs. And the point is simply for a marketplace person to just sort of step outside of the flow of their life and to basically reconnect with God and really build an intimacy with Jesus. And so the rule of life has really become something that has been woven into the fabric of a lot of the entrepreneurs that I work with. And it's something that I'm constantly putting people out there, putting for people to do out there, just because the first thing a marketplace leader does when they wake up in the morning is they check their email or they think about what it is that they have to do. And so the way for someone like that to actually seek first the kingdom of God is to organize their life around the essential things. And that's what a rule of life is about. And the thing I really like about this is sort of like the slow slog. Like spiritual formation is not something that just happens overnight. The reality of this is it just takes years. But it's that slow process of sort of this daily commitment of being formed by the Word of God, formed through our spiritual disciplines, which actually transforms the kind of people that we become. And those are the types of people that can witness in these types of environments. They don't come off as overly religious. They don't come off as overly harsh. They just come out. They're these fully orbed people who are able to fluidly operate in these different environments. I think that's sort of the character of Jesus that I notice most when I read the scriptures. And obviously, Bible talks a lot about how Jesus often withdraws to lonely places to pray. And I think that's sort of that formational component. And so I don't know, I just really encourage churches to make a rule of life, make spiritual formation a high priority for marketplace leaders. And the beauty of it is the kind of thing that, instead of asking somebody to lead a small group or to be on the welcoming team or the setup team or something on a Sunday, a rule of life is something that is actually done sort of the other 166 hours in a week. And they can organize it, based on the season of their life, based on their own sort of preferences, their own wiring. But it's the kind of thing that on a daily basis gets them situated properly to be, the kind of leaders that we want to see in the marketplace. The third point here is, go back actually one, I'm sorry. I really think it's important to develop a culture of worship. And here's what I mean by that. In a lot of churches that I visit, worship feels like something that is done for about 10 or 15 minutes before the sermon, and then about another 10 or 15 minutes after the sermon. So it sort of feels like an add-in. And then, when I talk to a lot of people about worship, if I ask them to just sort of describe what it is, and for a lot of folks, it's sort of like no different than going to a U2 concert or, a sort of a Mumford & Sons show, which I think there are elements of that with what worship is supposed to be, but I think a culture of worship is very different from that, because for me, worship is a way for me to remind myself. Because, again, as a marketplace leader, or as just a person in cities, you are constantly bombarded with alternative plans of salvation. You are constantly being told things that are just not in alignment with the scriptures. But to worship, and to worship with all of our bodies, to lift our hands up, to clap, to do things like that, it actually forms us, because we're reminding ourselves that, no matter what, like, God is still on the throne. No matter how bad my day is, no matter how messed up things feel right now, whether it's, in my business, in my family, in the outside world, that God is still on the throne. And so a culture of worship, rather than worship being, for too many business people, I think their take on worship is just sort of this thing we do. We sing a few songs before this, and then we sing a few songs at the end. And I think worship just needs to be a lot more than that. And so I don't know exactly what this looks like for various churches, but I do think that this is the kind of thing that I would put, just sort of high front and center, is develop a culture where people are constantly entering into the presence of God and reminding themselves that, the God of the universe remains on the throne. Next part. The second thing I think that the church can really offer is the following. And so just to set some context and reality, so marketplace leaders, we're essentially asked to be very creative problem solvers, to take risks and to be proven correct over time. And so this is something that's just true now more than ever in the age of information that we live in, is there's just no shortage of content available on how to be tactical, smart, and strategic. Most of the marketplace leaders in your churches, they went to a good undergraduate school, they went to a good business school, they have access to all the books on strategy. There's an unending supply, free and through books, online and through regular books that you can basically purchase that will tell you how to reason well as a business person. But the question I'm asking is, how do we develop marketplace leaders who are practically skilled, but are also wise and spiritually discerning? Those are two entirely different things. Being able to understand business strategy as it's taught in places like Harvard or MIT is one thing, but to be wise and discerning, to be able to choose among lots of good options, that's something that I think is, that's a spiritual discipline. That's not a purely mental thing. And so the church's response to that, I actually believe the church needs to be a place where leaders are equipped to regularly hear and discern the voice and will of God. A place where leaders are equipped to regularly hear and discern the voice and will of God. And so this is where I'll talk a little bit about my vineyard bona fides. The thing I love about the vineyard is that they're all about creating supernaturally natural environments, and everyone gets to play. So hearing from God, being able to receive divine wisdom from the God of the universe is not something that just a handful of prophetic people get. The healing gift is not just something that a handful of people. No, everybody gets to play. We're going to normalize the fact that the God of the universe is speaking to us, and we have access. As it says in John 14:12, Jesus says, "You will do even greater things than what I am doing." It's a mind-blowing promise, but it's actually true. In the Vineyard, we actually believe that. And so I think it's important to encourage the development of the prophetic gifts and a discerning posture among marketplace leaders. And specifically, develop the ability to differentiate between good ideas and God ideas. Differentiate between good ideas and God ideas. So again, a good idea is something you're going to be able to get if you're well trained. If you went to the right schools, if you're properly credentialed, you will be able to have good ideas. And as a marketplace leader that has to figure out, map strategy, cast vision, set a direction for an organization, there is no doubt that they will be able to come up with a handful of good ideas. But to be able to come up with God ideas, ideas that are clearly from the Holy Spirit, again, the Spirit of the Lord fell upon them and they were able to execute so-and-so, like the way the Bezalels did. I think that's the kind of leader that I think that we need to develop in these sort of urban settings. People that are just in the office, constantly communing with God, hearing from God. How do I, what does that person need right now at that moment? And then also, even in their quiet times, as you think about how do I strategize something? How do I come up with sort of a way to solve that problem? Just receiving these downloads and revelations from the Lord. So as an investor, I'll just share a quick story. About 5 years ago, there was this company called Tesla Motors that you guys may have heard of. And at the time, they were sort of like almost on the verge of bankruptcy. And I remember I was in Silicon Valley for an investor conference. And I walked into the Tesla store, and the guy, it was our first showroom in Palo Alto, and they gave me a test drive. And this was 5 years ago. I mean, this thing was like a spaceship. It was one of the most unbelievable experiences. I don't care much for cars, but this was a pretty extraordinary experience. And so I walked out of there, and I said to myself, gosh, this is really interesting. This company's about to go bankrupt. I don't know if you guys remember at the time. This is around the time of the 2012 election. They were famously called by Mitt Romney as a loser company because they were claimed that they were somehow going to be, they were getting all these green government subsidies, but and that they were never going to make it if not for government intervention. But in any case, I was really intrigued by the company. And so I sat down one day during my quiet time and I asked the Lord, hey, for some reason I'm really intrigued by what these guys are doing. What do you think, God? And I literally received a roadmap for how to research the company. So I want to be clear here. I didn't receive like a, hey, buy Tesla or don't buy Tesla. This isn't like some transactional health and wealth kind of gospel thing. That's not what this is at all. But what I did receive is a very interesting download of the kinds of questions that I should be asking as I'm researching this company. And what was interesting is that they were the kinds of companies that nobody else was asking. Because most of the people who were sort of the intelligentsia when it came to sort of the automobile industry, they were like, Tesla's going bankrupt. This thing's a waste of time. But what actually happened is we actually started to follow the research program that was given. And we started to learn things, and we started to discern things that nobody else was talking about. And as I realized this, I was saying to myself, my gosh, this is a potentially extraordinary opportunity. And we basically put a reasonably large share of our fund and our personal wealth into this company when the stock was trading at a fraction of where it's trading today. Now, Tesla's now like this huge, incredible story. Elon Musk is compared to Tony Stark in Iron Man. I actually think that the character is actually sort of patterned after Elon Musk. And he's sort of like this hero. He's sort of like the new Steve Jobs in some sense. But I say this because to go back to that time and, it was a very chancy thing that I was doing at that moment. It's just like saying, hey, God, I'm an investor. I think you care about what I'm doing. Spirit of the God, show me what I should be doing with this. And to sort of receive that roadmap, to execute on that roadmap, and to be able to benefit from that roadmap was an incredibly powerful thing. So next slide, please. So summary/conclusions. I think it's just important for marketplace leaders and pastors to develop real trust and a lot of collaboration. I just think we're way more similar than we are different. And the church, I'm a real sucker for the idea that the church is the hope for the world. I really actually do believe that. And so to me, it's very important that marketplace leaders and pastors just come together and build things together, because we're both at the core, we're entrepreneurs. The church is a place where we should be equipped to be the hands and feet of Jesus out in the world. And so, again, there's this huge temptation to invite marketplace leaders in to help build the church, which I'm all for doing. I'm all for building the local church. But at the same time, more than anything else, it should be a place for equipping. So we shouldn't measure our marketplace leaders on how many small groups they run, or whether or not they serve on our board, or whether or not how much they're giving to our building campaigns, but we should just measure them by kind of the impact that they're actually having in the various organizations that they're running. We're called to be, the church is a place of equipping, where we're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus out in the world. And so again, there's the two key things that I think that are really things that only the local church can deliver on. These things is to help an individual be formed into the image of Jesus through a rule of life and through these spiritual practices, to have these practices embedded into the culture of a church. So when a marketplace leader walks in, he or she knows that people here, they organize their lives around intimacy with Jesus. When they're not here at church in the mornings or in their evenings on a daily basis, they're seeking out the Word of God. They're constantly fueling themselves with the presence of Jesus. And second, develop an individual ability to hear, discern the will and voice of God. I think I've said a lot about it, but I just think that there's the Spirit-filled world. I think business people in general can be a little bit skeptical. Business people tend to be hyper-rational. Spirit-filled world can feel awkward. It can feel a little bit, I guess there's a term, charismatic and then charismaniac. So if you've been around the charismaniacs, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be like, those crazies. So I don't mind, I don't like human crazy. I don't mind God crazy. And sometimes, and your mileage may vary, but I think no matter what, it's essential to develop sort of a culture of people who are constantly hearing from God, discerning the will and the voice of God, for that to be just sort of a normal thing that happens in our churches, that happens both inside and outside. And lastly, I just want to quote Heidi Baker, who's a bit of a hero of mine. She says, all fruitfulness is born out of intimacy with Jesus. And I think that's sort of that sort of sums it up for me. Churches to be places where basically marketplace leaders have all kinds of on-ramps to be intimate with Jesus. As they grow in their intimacy with Jesus, as they're formed into the image of Jesus and they're able to hear from Jesus, they will be incredibly fruitful, I think, out in the marketplace. Thank you. Questions? Yes. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, you got business owners, and you got, right, but in the community where I come from.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that
Sure.
They don't want to be in church. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like this dynamic. But someone like you could change my ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Just having one or two families like you could impact an entire community.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? But I struggle. How do I get to you?
Well, good question. Conferences like this is one way, I suppose. I probably think that I'm just sort of speaking off the cuff here a little bit, but I think that I'm all for. I'm a big believer in a lot of what you're saying, and I think that I actually think the heart is there again, especially among sort of the younger generation that I'm around. I mean, they're all about crossing these sort of socioeconomic barriers, actually. But again, very practically, I think probably a trust network among pastors is where it starts, and then pastors with people, marketplace leaders in their community, have to be willing to be generative and generous with those relationships. Because on the one hand, I do understand a pastor wants to protect, because, I mean, this is true across the board. Marketplace leaders are in high demand. They're in high demand from other marketplace people. They're in high demand for fundraisers and so on and so forth. And so a pastor will naturally want to protect access to those types of people. And so they have to be judicious. But just like anything, I think there has to be sort of a willingness to have a generative spirit. And I think, as conferences like this enable those types of relationships between pastors of churches in different socioeconomic circumstances, I absolutely think that, that's sort of the first mechanism that comes to mind to help facilitate those types of relationships. Yeah. Christian. Okay, good question. Oh, certainly. So the question is, when a church planter is approaching a marketplace leader for funding or something of that nature, what are sort of a list of do's and don'ts? And so, good question. First thing I'll say is, what's not helpful. Here's what's not helpful is, and I don't think people do this intentionally, but I think it happens somewhat inadvertently, is there can be a sense of guilt. And again, this is sort of the whole sacred secular divide, is that there's this sense in which, hey, you're doing this, we're over here kind of doing the stuff that matters, and you should be somehow supporting that. That's not helpful. It's actually kind of true in some sense of the term, and I say that somewhat, there's a lot of flesh and context to what I mean by that, but at the same time, that's not helpful. And I think it's important to do one's best not to convey those types of sentiments. I think, though, in many ways, there's really no silver bullet to fundraising. Whether you're fundraising for your startup, for-profit startup, nonprofit startup, church plant, why people fundraise, why people give money to what they do, I have no idea. I know why my wife and I do, but I don't, even then it changes. And so here's the basic, so part of the reason I say that is I think the best you can do is convey the reality of your heart and vision. And essentially, it's hard to over-strategize these things. If I were to describe, though, to the best that I can, why certain things get funded and why other things don't get funded, I just think that donors just they have their own vision for kind of what they want to see happen. And it's not going to be about returns or like, I mean, you have to show fruitfulness, but fruitfulness is very hard to measure. So a donor just has a sense of the kinds of things that they want to back and that they want to. And so in many ways, probably the upfront work is the thing that you're doing, either where you're planting or the kinds of ministries that you're, do they somehow fit in the generic wheelhouse of that particular donor? And that requires just sort of upfront work. What's really sad is when a lot of donors, they just take meetings because they feel like it's important to take a meeting. And the reality is that the odds of them actually participating in are very, very small. So you save yourself a lot of time and brain damage if you just sort of try to filter a little bit and say, hey, look, is this the kind of thing that this person's even interested in, when you approach said person? So, yes?
I think one of the biggest obstacles that we face trying to disciple and care for marketplace leaders, like people who are executives or high capacity individuals, is time. They're very busy.
Yeah.
Probably, many of them will have a family, and time and access, they don't naturally fit into the regular rhythms of a church program.
Yes.
And so, do you have any ideas? I think the rule of life thing is great, but do you have any other ideas about how do we disciple, how do we care for these people who might not fit into a regular church program schedule?
Yes, and so definitely 10,000 amens. It's very difficult for these guys to plug into the regular programming. The vocational demands are very high. The rule of life is that thing that I think allows them, frankly, to stay connected to Jesus. I think, though, what you will find is, I don't know if this is still the norm, but the Sunday service and sort of the off week, Thursday night or Wednesday night or Tuesday night Bible study or prayer meeting or whatever. What I found, marketplace leaders in general are morning people. So if you want their time, it's sometimes a good idea. And if you're a pastor and you like to sleep in, or if you don't have to wake up at 6 a.m., this is a little bit tough. But to create those early morning communities, because early morning is actually, I think Eugene Peterson said, early morning and quiet time are one word for him. And I think there's something, creating those early morning communities, I think, is sort of a, because even if they have children, I'm talking about like 5:30, those types of things, but those can be sacred hours. But I think, it is the case that you have to just sort of be willing to work within certain boundaries and constraints. And that's where I think it really is important to, sort of believe that the work that they're doing, these 60, 70, 80 hours a week, is actually done unto the Lord, is done unto the glory of God. But I think from terms of how much they can give to the regular church programming, I think those are the limitations that we're working with. Yes?
What would you say are some of the major temptations or, spiritual kind of roadblocks in a marketplace leader that churches and ministries can look out for and kind of be there to support?
Great question. The question was, what are some of the natural temptations and pitfalls that marketplace leaders can fall into, that the church can be preemptive about? Which I love the idea of being preemptive, actually, because after the fact, it's usually a disaster. But again, I'll speak for men right now, just because I'm a man, and most of my ministry, to be honest, is with men. But it's this sort of we're not that complicated, and we haven't really evolved much, and so it's really money, sex, and power are the big things, and it just shows up in one of those forms. So again, it's not that complicated. It's just it's the way the seductive nature, and especially as someone as a young person is rising in their career. The world is just sort of waving these things like in front of you, and they're shiny, and they're cool, and they're pretty. And so the temptation of those things are just, they're just ever present. It's the waters in which they're swimming in all the time. And so again, it's hard to just a priori compete with that. But what I will say is find mature marketplace leaders in your church who, sometimes it's easier for a marketplace leader to tell another marketplace leader, hey, be radically generous. So when their pastor says that, it feels like there's an agenda. But you tell a marketplace leader, tell another marketplace leader, hey, early in your life, I mean, some of the best things that happened early for me in my marriage and in my walk with Jesus was just sort of the fact that, we're just determined to be radically generous no matter what. Whether we make this much, or whatever, we're always just going to live on a small amount, so to speak. And so the idea is sort of to preemptively develop these practices. Especially in New York, there's this incredible temptation, like everyone feels poor in New York. That's the incredible thing about Manhattan. So when you're a starving artist as an undergraduate and you make $30,000 a year, you feel poor. And your first job as an investment banker, you're making $150,000 or $200,000, you feel poor because there's always somebody who's richer than you, and that person is outbidding you on the apartment, and it goes on and on and on and on. And even if you're making tens of millions of dollars a year, there's some sheikh from the Middle East who basically is outbidding you on the penthouse of that whatever apartment. And so there's this constant temptation, I think. So I think you have to be preemptive. Like I actually, this was super controversial just a couple months ago when Mike Pence basically talked about the Billy Graham rule. Now I'm not about to go into all the craziness of that controversy right now, but I am very deliberate about how I relate to the opposite sex. Mostly because I know who I am. I know where some of my shortcomings reside. And so a lot of this stuff, preemptively fighting the temptation of money and lust, are things that I do preemptively. So I don't spend time with the opposite sex. My wife has access to all my emails, for example. And so at the point where you're tempted is a very dangerous place to be. If that line is over there, I want to live somewhere over here. And that's sort of the approach that I take. Yes?
Yeah, thanks. So what do marketplace business leaders need from the local church on Sunday morning? Right, so my question is, it seems like there's an increasing gap between Sunday morning and Monday morning for most people making that connection, integrating that. And is there anything that you've experienced personally or that you long for on Sundays that will prepare you better for Monday morning?
Great question. The question is, what do marketplace leaders need on Sunday morning that will prepare them for Monday and the week beyond? That's where I think a culture of worship is actually is something that I don't know. It could be just what I'm experiencing, but I remember I went to a couple vineyard churches 10, 15 years ago, and they worshiped for like an hour and like 15 minutes. And I mean, I'm not saying everyone should do that, but they were just like, oh, well, what's the Spirit doing? And so it just went on. And it was wonderful to just soak in the presence of God. So what you don't want Sunday to feel like is just sort of just another gathering where I go and say hi to some people and, like the talk is like a glorified TED Talk. Like there has to be something like otherworld, like there's a high bar, but you asked the question. You want to create like something sacred about that environment that sort of helps somebody, like again, it's like reconnecting with the real. Like the reality is God and God of the universe on the throne, and what actually happens, the temptations of the world are actually not real. Those are false gods. But like somehow create that environment on Sunday where they can sort of experience the sacred. I think too much of Sundays for me can feel like another event as opposed to and I mean that in the sense that you don't want another event that more or less looks like another event I could have gone to on Sunday morning. It has to somehow offer something that's just fully distinct, that is very unique to the people of Jesus. So, okay, one more. One more, Christian. The question is, how many burpees do I do a day? A lot. That's part of my morning rule of life, actually. So my rule of life actually embeds Actually, this might be, Andy Crouch once said that a lot of marketplace people, they wake up early. Marketplace leaders wake up early and they exercise. That describes me. I like to wake up early. I like to exercise. And we do this thing over in the city where we gather men early in the morning. We put them through a pretty harsh workout, kind of a modified CrossFit style thing. And they're about to vomit at the end of it. But that's an incredible place to enter into the presence of God. I mean, I kid you not, like to be able to read the scriptures when your body is just completely spent, and then to pray, to go through a couple spiritual disciplines of confession, to receive forgiveness. It's actually a very powerful thing. And so to the question earlier about, the kinds of things we can do, I think early morning exercise plus a spiritual discipline, that's been incredibly feeding to my soul. And so hopefully that might be something to consider as well. Drew.
I'm curious, sorry,
Sure.
like in church planning world, there's a certain kind of way in which we're encouraged to gather community, to mobilize them for mission, and so much of it is like creating a gathering, asking people to be welcomers, things like that. And as much as I like doing that stuff, I know that you've touched on things that have really kind of said, hey, there's a big world of ways that we can serve marketplace leaders to mobilize them for mission in a much more kind of like in a greater way. And I'm just curious, like for church planners, like what is the view? I mean, and you've been around some church planners as well.
Sure.
Heard stories and that sort of thing. Like what would your encouragement be to church planters about like, hey, kind of church planters can be so focused on just creating a gathering and wanting people to fit within that. And I'm wondering just like,
Yeah.
what would you say about like, hey, first of all, I encourage you to spend this amount of time, encourage marketplace leaders this way or that way, specific for church planters just getting started.
Totally. It's a great question just about, Drew was saying, and I feel this, and believe me, like I've walked alongside a lot of church planners, and like sort of creating that gathering and the gathering gift of being able to attract a bunch of people to a place. I mean, I feel that. I feel that, when if we're supporting a church planner and then we go to their go to their service and just like, wanting people to come, that whole thing. I get that fully and entirely. But I just think that there's just something going on right now among, especially again among a lot of the younger folks who are having trouble connecting with traditional church. And I don't think that means that there has to be necessarily some wholesale change into the way we do our programming. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I am suggesting is that, to really get, when you sow into a marketplace leader and demonstrate for them that following the way of Jesus, being steeped into the way of Jesus, actually leads to exponentially great life. You've got that person for life. They will feel the indebtedness. This is why, my attachment to the Vineyard is really that, because there was just, and it wasn't even anyone in particular, it was just the Vineyard hit me at a time when I was just like struggling with a lot of these things I was talking about, and it just they just put this stuff into me that is like sort of this gift that keeps on giving. And so when you do that for a marketplace leader, they may not be as great attendees, they may not lead the small groups, they may not, be welcoming, but they will be, you will have them. They will feel like your spiritual son and daughter, and so they'll find ways to contribute and to help build the thing that you're doing, because, if they're grateful as they should be, they should realize that the thing that they can give back to is exactly what enabled them to get to where they are in the first place. So, great. Thank you very much.